task of greeting Matti Friedman and introducing him. He asked me to make it sound, he should sound like a good guy, a nice guy, but not too nice. So I'll try to balance this. He's Canadian-Israeli journalist and author. He's an op-ed contributor to the New York Times and columnist for Tablet magazine. He was born in Toronto in 1977 and immigrated to Israel at the age of 17. He was what you could call the anchor child because his parents and his sister moved after him 1 year later. And is present. He made Aliyah and thought he was going up in the world. Last time I checked, his height was 172 centimeters. Yeah, okay, yeah, that's good. He is married, he has 3 children, and he lives in Jerusalem, in Talpiot. 4? Mazel tov. Yeah, or I didn't check closely enough, but mazel tov, that's very good. And his wife, very interestingly, I think, is the descendant of an old Yishuv Jewish family with roots in the old Sephardi community of Jerusalem and Hebron. And he served in the IDF, the Nahal Brigade, in the Israeli security zone in southern Lebanon during the South Lebanon conflict in the late 1990s, spending much of his service at a position called Outpost Pumpkin. And he wrote about this in the book Pumpkin Flowers. After the service, he studied at Hebrew U. Friedman has written more books, the Aleppo Codex, about the oldest, most complete, most accurate text of the Hebrew Bible. And in 2019, he published Spies of No Country, about 4 Arabic-speaking Jews who operated an Israeli pre-independence Zionist intelligence unit, the so-called Arab section, in Beirut, which at the time was in the territory of the French Mandate for Syria and Lebanon. He has won several book awards, and from 2006 to 2011, he was a reporter and editor in the Jerusalem office of the Associated Press. He also worked as a reporter in Egypt, Morocco, Lebanon, Moscow, and Washington, D.C. And he first drew real attention with a pair of essays about anti-Israel bias in the media that included sharp criticism of his employer at the time, the Associated Press. And the agency had more than 40 staffers covering Israel and the Palestinian territories. That was significantly more than the AP had in China or Russia or India or in all of the 50 countries of sub-Saharan African continent combined. And Friedman said at the time, I don't mean to pick on the AP. The agency is wholly average, which makes it useful as an example. I hope I'm not taking the whole lecture going, but the big players in the news business practice groupthink, and these staffing arrangements were reflected across the herd, the flock. And he is also quoted by Konrad Myrland in his book, The falske bildet av Israel, The False Picture of Israel. You're quoted there, so you're world famous in the whole of Norway. He has written a moving account of Leonard Cohen in Israel during the Yom Kippur War in 1973. The title was Who by Fire? It refers to the Cohen song, which is a reference to the Untanei Tokev Kedushat Hayom, make claim to today's holiness, a Hebrew prayer chanted on Yom Kippur. The prayer is said to have been written by a rabbi dying from his wounds after he was put to death for his unwillingness to convert. And with this not too praising, I hope, words, I want to introduce Matti, and his first lecture will be on Israel and the media. Matti, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I will try to live up to it. It's wonderful to be here. It's my first time not only in Norway, but in any Scandinavian country, and I've spent a few days in this beautiful city, and I've been having a lovely time, and I'd just like to thank Conrad and the crew for giving me the opportunity to be here and to speak to you. I'd love to talk to you about Leonard Cohen and his concert tour in the Yom Kippur War, but I've been instructed that this may not be fun in any way. It has to be completely serious, and we have to talk about weighty matters that are often very dark. So if you'd like to speak about Leonard Cohen, we can do so afterward. But what we're going to talk about now is about Israel and the media. I think what Conrad quite accurately calls a false picture of Israel. And I'm going to look at this through my own years as a correspondent working for the international press, mainly as a correspondent for the Associated Press, the AP, which is the big American news agency, which is the world's largest news organization, according to the AP. According to Reuters, by the way, Reuters is the world's biggest news organization. But those are the two big agencies that provide much of the news coverage that you consume, even in Norway. I was born in Toronto, moved to Israel when I was 17. I intended to be in Israel for 1 year. Just before college, I spent a year milking cows on a kibbutz, a religious kibbutz in northern Israel. And that was 28 years ago. And I got stuck. Obviously, I'm still there. And I've had many adventures since moving to Israel. Some of them you heard in the introduction. Beyond milking cows, I studied Islamic studies at Hebrew University and served in the military for 3 years and became a journalist. And most of my time as a journalist was spent covering Israel for international audiences. And this helped me understand the way that the story of Israel is told or mistold for international audiences. And I'm going to try to put my finger on 4 main points that are of interest, or 4 points on which there's a real gap in perception between the story of Israel as it's told and the reality of Israel as it exists. And I imagine that most of you have been to Israel and you've seen this or felt it, and this might help you kind of put words and numbers to a feeling that people have, which is that the reality of the country has almost nothing to do with the depiction of the country in the media or international perceptions beyond the media. And I'll give you an example that I was just discussing with Conrad. I was walking around downtown Oslo, which is beautiful and amazing, and I stopped in every bookstore that I could find, of course, and I was in one bookstore near the university, and I just looked at the Israel shelf to see what was on offer, and there were about 10 books, I would say, on Israel. The shelf was called Israel-Palestine, and every single book was critical. It ranged from somewhat critical to rabidly critical, and there was not a single book on the shelf that was not just not positive, but not just a normal objective history of the country. So clearly there is some problem in the perception of Israel that goes beyond the media, and it involves the academy and the broader world of academic pursuits and bookstores in Oslo or in other Western capitals. So I'm just going to dive right in, and we're going to look at something that is quite basic, so basic that often people don't even think to comment on it, and that is the level of personal safety in Israel, or the level of violence in Israel. And we often take for granted that Israel is the scene of one of the most important conflicts in the world. That's because it is covered so heavily, and we heard some of the numbers just now. When I was an AP correspondent, that was an accurate number, we had 40 full-time correspondents covering Israel, or the Israel story rather, which is 9 million people in Israel proper. That's the citizens of Israel, 9 million. So Israel's a country roughly the size of New York City in terms of population. By the way, as a percentage of the world's surface, Israel is 1/100th of 1% of the surface of the world. 0.01% of the world is Israel. And as a percentage of the landmass of the Arab world, which is where Israel is situated, Israel is 1/5 of 1%, 0.2% of the Arab world is Israel in terms of landmass, and we had 40 full-time staffers covering the story, 9 million Israelis plus 4 or 5 million Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. So we're talking about a story that encompasses, let's say, 14 million, 15 million people with 40 full-time news staffers there working for the AP. And just to give you a point of comparison, that was more staff than we had at the time covering all of the 50-something countries of sub-Saharan Africa. It was more than we had in China, which is a country of 1.3 billion people. So we had more people covering 15 million Jews and Muslims in Israel and Palestine than we had in all of China. We had more staff in Israel than we had in India, which also has 1.3 billion. We had more staff in Israel than we had in all of the countries where the Arab Spring eventually erupted, combined. So I could go on and on with these examples, but you get the picture. For the AP, which is the world's largest news organization, according to the AP, Israel was the most important story in the world outside of the United States. It was the biggest international bureau. And that was true not just of AP, it was true of all the players in what we used to call the mainstream press or the legacy press, Reuters, BBC, CNN, New York Times, Washington Post. All of the big news players staffed the Israel story as if it were the most important international story, the most important story in the world. And sometimes when you point out that that is quite strange to have more staff in Israel, which is a tiny country, than you do in China, which was true at the time. When I was at the AP, this is between 2006 and the very end of 2011, sometimes the response would be, but there's a conflict in Israel. So the numbers are justified not by the size of the country, but by the fact that a conflict exists. And this conflict is one of the most important conflicts in the world. Many of you remember until recent years when people used the term Mideast conflict, the Mideast conflict, what they meant was the conflict in Israel, which is, again, 0.2% of the landmass of the Arab world. But the Mideast conflict was said to be the one in Israel. And that gives people an impression of a lot of violence. And when people come into Israel, often they're afraid about personal safety. They have concerns that they might be walking into something that might feel like a war zone. And that is because every instance of violence in Israel, and particularly in Jerusalem, which is the city where I live and the city that is the center of coverage, every instance of violence is shot from maybe 50 different angles by different news crews. And it gives people the sense that there is a lot of violence going on. And then you come to Jerusalem and you walk around and it doesn't feel particularly violent most of the time, or it doesn't quite live up to what people might have been imagining. And here we can actually quantify this in an interesting way by looking at fatality numbers. And I'm going to apologize before I do this comparison, because comparing places on Earth by the number of people who die in them is a very problematic comparison. So I'm not saying that this is the whole picture. I'm not saying that this is a complete description of the conflict, because of course conflicts manifest themselves in ways that are not necessarily fatal. So people could be wounded and not killed. People could sustain psychic damage, psychological damage. People can be humiliated. People can be wounded in many ways in a conflict and not necessarily killed. So this is a partial measure. But I think it does make a very interesting point about the scale of violence versus the scale of attention. And it's a comparison that no one else will ever make for you. So I'm going to do it. If we take the city of Jerusalem, just as a good example, last year, 2022, the calendar year that ended on December 31st, and we take every violent death in the city of Jerusalem last year. So I'm looking at any human-on-human violence that resulted in a fatality. I'm looking at a terrorism, political violence of any kind. I'm looking at domestic homicide, criminal homicide, not car accidents, but violence. And I guess I should say that Jerusalem is a city of almost 1 million. So it's 900,000 people inching up toward 1 million people. And I should also say that the police will not give you this number, which is very annoying. In America, a police department will release a homicide number at the end of the year, which makes it easy for the journalists. In Jerusalem, they won't do it for whatever reason. So I have to put it together by myself by looking at human rights reports and press reports and trying to figure out the number. So I might be off by 1 or 2. That's all I mean by this extended apology. But the number of deaths in Jerusalem last year, as far as I can tell, was 14. We had 14 deaths in Jerusalem for any reason, including domestic homicide and criminal homicide, what we would call regular homicide, the kind of thing that exists in any city in the world. And yet there are probably more foreign observers in Jerusalem than in any other city in the world perhaps with the exception of Washington, D.C., not just press, but NGO staff, UN staff. There's a huge international presence in Jerusalem, paying very close attention to a conflict that last year, or a city that last year produced 14 fatalities. And just to give you a sense of comparison, in Indianapolis, which is a city in the United States that is the same size as Jerusalem, so it's an effective comparison just because it's an easy one to make. In Indianapolis last year, the number of homicides was 212. No one thinks there's a war in Indianapolis. So there's no massive UN presence in Indianapolis. There's no international press presence in Indianapolis. I think the American press doesn't pay particularly close attention to Indianapolis. My sense is that the Indiana press might not be very closely focused on Indianapolis. Jacksonville, Florida, is another city in the United States that has the same population as Jerusalem. And I apologize that my examples are very America-centric, but I worked for an American media outlet, and my attention is focused largely on the world's largest media market, which is that one. Jacksonville, Florida is another city where no one thinks there's a war. Jacksonville last year had 170 homicides, which is standard for Indianapolis. That's for Jacksonville. That's the number that they have every year. And by that measure, Jacksonville, Florida is a city more than 10 times deadlier than Jerusalem. If we look at the overall death toll in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict last year, and that is a term that I'm going to unpack in a moment, but let's accept for a moment that there's an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The number for last year, and again, it's hard to get good numbers, and I'm going to apologize again for the problematic nature of this comparison because any number is too many. So I'm not saying that these numbers are okay. It should be 0. I'm not also saying that the numbers are not my fault necessarily. The conflict is at least in part the fault of the side that I'm on, which is the Israeli side. So I'm not trying to shirk responsibility for the conflict. I'm not trying to say that the conflict doesn't exist. I'm just trying to make a point about scale. The number for last year is 190. Again, you'll see, 2 more, 3 less, but it's about 190 fatalities in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is awful. It's 190 too many, and it is still lower than the number for Indianapolis. So in this conflict, which is the most heavily covered conflict on Earth over time, over the past 50, 60, 70 years, we have deaths that actually don't measure up to the death toll in many American cities. And you'll notice that I'm not comparing it to other conflicts because that makes the comparison too easy. So if we look at the Syria conflict, for example, Syria is, of course, about 2.5 hours driving from my house in Jerusalem, very close, of course. From the West Bank, it's about a 90-minute drive to Syria. The death toll in Syria since the civil war erupted in 2011 is estimated at about 500,000. So 500,000 fatalities. Again, no one's quite sure, but it's somewhere around there. Iraq, since the American intervention, which is 20 years old, almost exactly, about 300,000 fatalities in Iraq. That's the estimate you'll usually see. There are higher and lower estimates, but the one you'll usually see is 300,000 fatalities. To give you an example of a conflict that is really bad, but no one cares about it in the West, Congo. In Congo, the death toll is estimated at about 5 million fatalities. But no one is paying close attention. The Western press corps isn't there because it's not a place that's of interest to people from the West. What I mean to say is that Western attention is not allocated according to a rational set of standards. So if people think that we're hearing a lot about Israel, more about Israel than about all of Africa south of the Sahara, if we believe that this is because of the number of people dying or the scale of the conflict in terms of blood, that is not the reason. The coverage of Israel is not heavy because Israel ranks first on a graph of global conflict in terms of the number of people who are being killed or wounded. That is not the reason. In fact, for many American correspondents who are in Israel, reporting from Jerusalem, they're in a place that is safer than the city that they're from, which is not the kind of thing that you can ever point out as a journalist. Not necessarily because of ideological bias, and there is an ideological bias in play, but because, I don't know if anyone here has ever worked as a journalist. I know that there's at least one. But if you have worked as a journalist, you know that you can never start a story by saying, this is not important. right? You'll never see a news story that opens, nothing much happened in Jerusalem on Tuesday. There were 10,000 peaceful interactions between Jews and Muslims. No one will read that story. If you'll notice in a news headline, tensions are always going up. Tensions rose in the Middle East this week. Israeli actions ratcheted up tensions in the Middle East. You'll never see a headline that says tensions are going down. And you have to wonder, tensions are always going up. How is it possible? Like at what point does that thermometer just kind of explode? Because how can it be going up for 100 years? And never coming down? The answer is that if you write a headline that says tensions came down, no one will read it. Because the story has to be exciting. We want you to click on it. So there's, I guess, a mechanism inherent in journalism that makes us want to sell you a story by convincing you that this is the most important thing that you're going to read today. And if there are more reporters in Israel than there are in India or in all of sub-Saharan Africa, and all of the reporters are inflating, then you get this behemoth of a news story that makes the actual country impossible to understand. So if you go into Israel with the idea that this is one of the most important global conflicts, and then you come to the country and you realize that this is a tiny country, there is a conflict, it is real, but it is very, very small, not just compared to global conflicts, but compared to many cities in places like the United States of America, there's going to be a gap and kind of a difficulty in understanding the reality. And again, this is something that's inherent in journalism, not just in the Israel story. Let's say I'm sent, to use another American example, to cover a pro-Trump protest in New York City. And I go to the main square, and I'm there to cover the protest, and I find that there are two guys there, and they have a paper they've taken from their computer printer at home, and they've written in magic marker, it says, "Make America Great Again" on the paper. But there are two people there. So as a reporter, I can do one of two things. I can call my editor and say, "Listen, I don't have a story. There are two people here." Editors hate that because you've already gone all the way to New York to cover the protest. So your other option is to write a story that sounds like this. A small but vocal group of pro-Trump supporters, excuse me, a small but vocal group of Trump supporters gathered in New York Wednesday. You see what I did there? I didn't lie. I just didn't spell out the numbers, because the numbers make my story sound silly. And there's a lot of that. In journalism, again, it's not necessarily ideological. In Israel, we have the addition of an ideological bias in many cases, but often it's just journalists selling their goods. And that's a part of the way the business works, and it's worth knowing. And in the case of Israel, it really gives you the sense that there is a lot more going on than actually is. And often for people who take an interest in Israel, when I say, we covered Israel more than China, sometimes people look at me with a look that says, yeah, of course. Yeah, Israel's more important than China. So for some of us it is. I mean, for me it is. Israel's more important for me than China. But if the news is supposed to be a rational analysis of events on planet Earth, which is what we claim that it is. If that's what it is impossible to cover Israel more than all of Africa or more than India. It just doesn't make sense. And it really indicates that Western attention is a very strange creature. It behaves in odd ways that need to be understood, I think, with more criticism and not accepted at face value. Okay, that's just the first point, which is about the scale of coverage and the scale of violence in Israel. The second point is a phrase that I used in a kind of offhand way a moment ago, which is the idea of an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That terminology is used so often that even we Israelis don't question it anymore. And you can spend years discussing politics in Israel, and you will use that framing of the problem, because that is the framing that is used by and large by the press. When I was at the AP, every day at the bureau in Jerusalem, we had to write a story that was called Israelis Palestinians. We called it Is Pals in the jargon of the bureau, and it was the usual news wrap of the day's events. What did Netanyahu say? What did Abbas say? Settlements, rockets, the Israeli-Palestinian story as it is familiar to millions and millions of readers around the world. And that has become so accepted that we can forget that in fact there is no Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the way that people imagine. And I know that sounds crazy because everyone thinks there is, but in fact, most of Israel's wars have not been fought against Palestinians. And I'm not saying anything controversial. This is clearly true. Israel, unfortunately for us, has fought wars against Jordanians and Iraqis and Lebanese and Syrians and Egyptians. And Israel's most potent enemy at the moment is Iran, right? The Iranians are not Palestinian. The Iranians, in fact, are not Arabs. They're Muslim, of course, but they're Persian. They're not Arab. So clearly there is a broader conflict going on here that isn't Israeli-Palestinian. And again, this isn't a controversial statement, but when you construct a news story, it has to be really simple. Many of you have probably been in the position of reading bedtime stories to children, and you know that what works in a bedtime story is a princess and a dragon. Like a good guy and a bad guy. Two characters, one you can really identify with and one you can really hate. That is the ideal setup for a children's story. And journalism works the same way. And often we resist the fact that journalism is a form of storytelling that's much closer to literature than we like to admit. We journalists like to believe that journalism is a form of science. So you have chemistry, biology, journalism, physics, but actually we're engaged in storytelling, and what works in a bedtime story is what works in a news story. You need two characters if possible, and a good guy and a bad guy if possible. So there's a real interest in boiling down a complicated story into a dynamic that looks something like the princess-dragon dynamic. To give you an example of another story, what is the international news story that really has people's attention right now in the West? It's Russia-Ukraine, right? That's the one people are really paying attention to. Why does that story have such a grip on the Western imagination when there are many other conflicts going on in the world? One is that the people in the conflict look like people from the West. That's one of the hidden drivers of Western attention. Secondly, it's a princess dragon story. Right? You have a good guy, an underdog, who's fighting, a bad guy, kind of a Darth Vader type character, and to me it seems quite accurate. But this is why that story works. So a story that is a very complicated regional mess involving Jordanians and Egyptians and Syrians and Iranians is not a story that anyone will pay attention to because it is too complicated. It's too complicated to be a potent, simple narrative that people can get involved in by choosing a side. And that is actually one thing that you want people to do when you're writing a news story. You want people to be able to imagine themselves into the story. If you meet an average Israeli, and this might have happened to you, and you ask people for their family history, they'll say, my dad fought against the Syrians in the 1973 war. My grandfather fought against the Jordanians in the War of Independence in 1948. My grandmother is a Jew from Baghdad who got run out of Baghdad when the Muslim majority in Iraq kicked out all of the Jews in the early 50s. That's a standard Israeli story. It has nothing to do with Palestinians. Because for Israelis, it's a regional story. It's not primarily a story about Palestinians. And when we see the conflict, we are zoomed out to see the whole region. So if you look at the Arab world, there are 300 million people in the Arab world, a small number of whom are Palestinian. And if you zoom out even farther to the level of the Islamic world, you have 1.5 billion people, or 2 billion, there's some argument about the numbers. And in one corner of that part of the world, there are 6 million Jews who are called Israelis. So Israelis do not feel like an empowered majority. They only seem that way if your story is about an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We see ourselves as an embattled minority, outnumbered by 300 million people in the Arab world or by 1.5 billion people in the Islamic world. And there is, I think, an importance in understanding when approaching the Israeli-Palestinian segment of the conflict. It's important to understand that both sides, Israelis and Palestinians, see themselves as an embattled minority. The Palestinians view themselves as an embattled minority under Israeli rule, and there's a lot of truth to that. And Israelis see themselves as an embattled minority in the Arab world, and there's a lot of truth in that. And it really just depends on how tightly you're zoomed in. Because if you're zoomed in very close and all you can see is Israel, which is that 0.2% of the landmass of the Arab world, then it does seem that my side, the Israeli side, is much more prosperous, much more militarized, much more Western, much stronger than the other side. And that's all true. And it becomes very hard to understand what my problem is. what is my problem? The Palestinians clearly do not pose an existential threat to me. What is my problem? I must be evil. There's really no other conclusion you can reach. My behavior becomes impossible to understand unless you're zoomed out and you understand that we see this as a regional story. And it's a story where there are 6 million Jews living among 300 million people in the Arab world, most of them Muslim, or amid 1.5 billion people in the Islamic world. And then you can begin to understand Israeli political behavior. So often journalists can really flip a story by zooming in and zooming out. Sometimes journalists are accused of lying. In my experience, journalists rarely lie. What they'll do is they'll frame a story in the way that delivers the political conclusion that they want. And this is a good example. If you frame it as a story of a very small ethnic minority that's fighting for its life surrounded by people who are generally hostile, unfortunately, you reach a certain conclusion, or you begin to understand why Israelis behave the way they do. You begin to understand why Israeli policies look the way they look. You can even begin to understand why Israeli mistakes look the way they look. And we do make many errors of judgment, and I can give you a long list. We've made many, serious errors of judgment, including, in my opinion, electing the current government that we have. In my opinion, a mistake by the Israeli electorate. But you can't begin to understand that mistake unless you see how Israelis view themselves in the Middle East. It becomes incomprehensible if all you're seeing is Israelis and Palestinians. I'll give you an example. Have you ever heard of the America-Italy War of 1943? American soldiers were dying in Italy in 1943. But you've never heard of the America-Italy War because it was called World War II, right? And it makes no sense that Americans are in Italy unless you understand that it's World War II, that there's a global conflict going on. And you must understand the Germans and the Japanese and the British and the Russians. And once you begin to understand all of the players in the global conflict, it begins to be possible to understand why Americans are in Italy and why it wouldn't make any sense to demand an American-Italian peace agreement in 1943. That's not the war. The zoom is too tight. You're seeing a component of a much bigger picture that is much broader and much more complicated. And the same trick has been played in the case of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. If you're zoomed in so tight that all you can see are Israelis and Palestinians, nothing I do makes any sense. The only possible way to understand this is by zooming out and seeing all of the regional context, and then the pieces begin to fall into place, even if you might think that some Israeli policies are misguided or that our leadership is wrong on many counts, which I happen to think. But I understand why those mistakes are made because I see this in regional perspective. Okay. That was the second point about framing, how a news story is framed. Often if we accept the framing of the conflict as Israeli-Palestinian, there's no way to win an argument, because in many ways the argument has been won by framing the conflict in that way. And if you accept that framing, then you're left with some kind of a small-scale skirmishing about whether the settlements are a good idea or whether Israel's response in Gaza was too aggressive. You're left kind of arguing about the details in a way that it's almost impossible to make Israel's case. The only way to do it is to accept that it's a regional story. It's a regional story. You have to zoom out. And I reject the framing of my dilemma as an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That is not my problem. If that were the problem, we could solve it. If this were just a problem between two small actors in the Middle East, we could solve it just like the Protestants and the Catholics in Northern Ireland could solve it, or kind of solve it. They could move on, or just like the Croats and the Serbs could move on. If you think that this is a small conflict happening in isolation, you reach a series of conclusions which are incorrect. We have to view this regionally. Thirdly, it took me years as a journalist to figure out that these terms were wreaking havoc with people's understanding of Israel. The terms left and right. As journalists, we use terms like left and right because we don't have any room. We don't have time to explain the complexities of people's political positions. So I can't get into exactly what everyone's policy position is. I just call them right. So this prime minister is right, and I'm sure it's done, without knowing much about Norwegian news coverage, I'm sure it's done here as well. This prime minister is right, and the opposition is left, and this policy is right-wing, and that policy is left-wing. We do it all the time, and I've done it all the time myself, because we just, if you have 600 words in a news story, or 90 seconds in a TV spot, that's the average length of a TV spot, or 280 characters on Twitter or whatever it is, you simply do not have room for anything else. So we use the terms left and right interchangeably and pretend that they mean the same thing in different countries. So in the American news industry, you see this in a pretty overt way. American reporters will call the Republican Party right-wing, and they will call Netanyahu right-wing, using the same terminology. Or same thing, goes for the left. So you'll see the protests in Israel right now being described as protests of the left. And to Western news audiences, that means something very specific. So to a British reader, the word left-wing means something. To an American reader, the word left means something. And to readers here, it means something. And you apply it to this other foreign scenario where it is not going to help you understand anything. And I'll give you an example. If you look at the Israeli political spectrum, and you take the Israeli right, the Likud party, let's just take Netanyahu as a right-wing prime minister, and let's say we could take Netanyahu and send him to America and have him pursue a political career in America. Not to give away too much about my own politics, but that would be okay with me if we could do that. Unfortunately, not enough voters agree with me, so here we are. But if we were to send him to America, we would find that Netanyahu would be on the American left. He would be in the Democratic Party in the United States on all of the red flag issues that Americans care about. For example, abortion, of course, is a big issue, for the American left-right divide. In Israel, abortion is not controversial. So I've never met an Israeli who votes on abortion as an issue. Abortion is legal in Israel, and it's paid for by state healthcare, which is also not controversial in Israel. Another big, very controversial issue for Americans, not controversial for Israelis. Everyone in Israel more or less agrees that every citizen should have healthcare. And that's because, of course, that's true. That's why we think that, much like Canadians and much like citizens of the European social democracies, that's not a controversial issue for Israelis. Gun control, another big right-left issue. For Israelis, not particularly controversial. Guns are difficult to obtain in Israel. Depending on where you're from, I'm certainly from a country like Norway, and the same is true of Canada. When you come to Israel, you will see more guns openly displayed than you're used to. And often people conclude that it must be easy to get a weapon in Israel because you see so many of them around. That's not true. To get a gun in Israel, you need a psychiatric check, you need a police background check, you need a reason to have a gun, you get licensed to carry a specific handgun with a serial number, and you cannot buy a rifle. There's no way to buy a rifle. So if you see weapons displayed in Israel, usually that's security personnel, even if they're in civilian clothes. It doesn't correspond to the right-left divide in American politics. On most issues, the Israeli political DNA is very red, like communist red, not Republican red. Israel is a country that's founded by radical socialists. And although we've gone quite capitalist in the past 20 or 30 years, and it turns out that Israelis are pretty good at capitalism. Not this Israeli, unfortunately, but many of my countrymen seem to know what a stock is and know how to trade them. And if you've been to Tel Aviv in the past few years, you've seen the skyscrapers go up and you've seen this amazing boom, which is predicated obviously on some kind of understanding of capitalism. The country's DNA remains quite left in terms of public education, public transportation, public health, things like maternity leave. It's a country that would make much more sense to a citizen of a country like Norway than it would to a citizen of a country like the United States. And yet, in the news coverage, we describe the Israeli government as being right-wing. I'll give you one last example. Does the name Amir Ohana mean anything to you? Amir Ohana is a very important politician in Israel. He's the Speaker of Parliament. He was here. Oh, no kid. For this conference? A couple years ago? A fascinating guy. I profiled him for the New York Times a few years ago. I disagree with him on almost everything. He's a very, but I like him. He is a right winger on the right, so he's considered a real hawk in Israeli politics. And of course, as you know, if you were here, Amir is not just gay, but he's out of the closet. And I follow him on Facebook, so I consume a lot of Amir Ohana content. So I can tell you that his partner is a guy named Alon, who's a stockbroker in Tel Aviv, and they have two children named Ella and David, who were born to a surrogate mother in Oregon, in the United States. None of this is important. I just happen to know it, so I'm telling you. A guy like Amir Ohana does not make any sense on the right in the United States in 2023. And that's because what makes you right and left in Israel has nothing to do with what makes you right or left in almost any other country. What makes you right or left traditionally is your view on the conflict with the Arab world. If you think that concessions on Israel's part will make things better, territorial withdrawals, if you think that will make things better for Israel, then you're on the left. If you think that concessions on Israel's part will make things worse for us by broadcasting weakness, by inviting further attacks against us, then you're on the right. And it doesn't really matter what you think about anything else. So you can be Amir Ohana, and you can be on the right. And you can be a free market capitalist, and you can be on the left. And you can be in favor of free access to abortion, and you can be on the right. And you can be in favor of tight gun control, and you can be on the right. It doesn't work like it works in other countries because the defining issue is not one that applies in America or Canada or Norway. And we use these terms as if they mean the same thing, but they actually conceal more than they reveal. And if you come to Israel and just assume that right and left mean the same thing, then you won't be able to make heads or tails of the actual politics of the country. There is one issue on which there is an increasing similarity, unfortunately, at least in the American political scene, which is the kind of populist sentiment that sees a deep state embedded in the machinery of the country, which is kind of an unelected elite that thwarts the democratic will of the people. That's a very that's an idea familiar to people who are following, the kind of politics around Trump and the Republican Party in the past couple of years. The idea of a deep state, people who have been embedded in the system and who are preventing the will of the people from being manifest. That idea has really bled into Israel and other countries, I think largely because of social media, but this is happening. American ideas are kind of spreading elsewhere. And in Israel today, that issue is also in play. So the right in power now, we have a very right-wing, by our standards, government in power at the moment, and they have marked the court system as being a deep state that is unelected and representative of a left-wing elite that must be removed in order to allow the democratic will of the people to be expressed. And that is happening in a big way in Israel. It's become one of the main parts of this government platform. It's behind the legal reform package, which is really a kind of, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say it's ripping Israeli society apart. We're seeing massive protests against this government policy, and you're seeing the government really throwing its weight behind this idea that the court system, and particularly the Supreme Court, has to be weakened or gutted in some way to allow the government to pursue its own policies. In Israel, as many of you probably know, the only check on government power is the Supreme Court. There's no constitution, and there's no second legislature. So there's no Senate and Congress, and there's no regional legislature, and there's no written document that guarantees my rights in Israel. All there is the Supreme Court. So the government can pass legislation with a simple majority. The only thing that can block that legislation is a judge saying this legislation does not match Israel's own laws. And the government is seeking to change that balance of power so that any simple majority will be able to enact any piece of legislation that it wants without that checking capacity by the court. So that very much is in play on the left and right divide in Israel. And in that way, it is similar to discourse in other countries. And that's kind of the kind of smell of populism is present in Israel, as it is, of course, elsewhere in the world. Now, I'm just going to mention briefly the fourth point on which there is a major perception gap, and I'm going to mention it briefly because it's the subject of my next talk, but I think it might be the most important one, and then we'll have time for some questions. So I'm just going to say what it is, and we won't get into the details. The ethnic makeup of Israel. If you grew up in a Jewish community, as I did in North America, or if you grew up knowing something about Israel outside of the Jewish community, you learned a European story about Israel. And that story is Theodor Herzl in Vienna and the birth of political Zionism as a response to violence against Jews in Europe, and the labor Zionist idea, the kibbutz idea, and of course the Holocaust looms very large in that story. And then you have the first generation of Israeli heroes, David Ben-Gurion, Golda Meir, Moshe Dayan. That was the story of Israel as I knew it when I moved to Israel in 1995. As a 17-year-old from Canada, and I had to admit very quickly that that story does not explain the country. And there are a few things going on there, but the main thing, in my opinion, is that if you look at the Israeli Jewish population, so we have a 1/5 Arab Muslim minority, I'm just setting them aside for a moment, and I'm looking at that 80% Jewish majority. If we look at the Jews in Israel, at least half of them did not come from Europe. At least half of the Jews in Israel can trace their family roots to the Islamic world, to places like Morocco, Tunisia, Libya, Syria, Yemen, Iran, Afghanistan. It's more than half of the Jews in Israel. And we've always treated it as a footnote, and we've never put those Israelis in the center of our national story. But in fact, the country is incomprehensible unless those people are at the center of the national story and unless we abandon the European narrative about Israel and accept Israel for what it is in 2023, which is a Middle Eastern country. That will be the subject of the next talk, which will begin shortly. I'd like to leave as much time as possible for questions, comments, heckling, and we'll let it run for as long as Conrad will let us. Yes, anyone? Or have I answered absolutely any question that everyone might have? Oh. It's very high tech. Yeah. Oh, you have a mic, okay.
It even works. That water is for you, by the way.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And you should have it because it's from Oslo. Fantastic water.
High quality Norwegian water. straight from the fjord.
My father always said, why don't we export water to Israel? They need it. And look, it's so easy. Look at the map. It's going down all the way. Anyway, let's go back to the...
I would like to buy stocks in that company.
Now let's see. Technology for me, technology for you. Let's see. We will use 12 minutes so for questions and answers on this, and then we will have a quarter of break. And then we will have a quarter of a minute, a quarter of an hour break. So now let's see. You see, we have censorship here. The questions come to Conrad, and he's sending them to me. The ones he want you to answer. Okay, so. If you became the news editor of Norwegian public broadcaster called NRK, for a week, what are the 3 top stories you would instruct your journalists to cover to balance 4 decades of anti-Israel coverage? I would like to correct that. We are not, unfortunately, talking about 4 decades. Okay, we are talking about more than 5 decades. It started pretty immediately after the Six-Day War. But what 3 top stories would you ask your journalists to cover to the Norwegian public?
Thank you for this appointment. I'm very honored. I'm not sure my Norwegian is good enough, but I'll do my best in the next week to provide Norwegians with the news coverage you deserve. I must say that I think it's less an issue of specific positive stories. So sometimes people ask me what I think should be covered, and with the idea that if we could only cover certain positive aspects of Israel, things would be balanced. And I can give you a list of positive stories, Israeli innovation and things like that. But I actually think that that this goes much deeper, and it requires us to ask what the story about Israel is hoping to achieve. Is it a matter of oversight by journalists? Did they simply not know about these 3 or 4 stories? And were they to be aware of the stories, the coverage would look different? Or are we talking about a story that is not, in fact, a news story? And here I can already imagine the very long and stormy editorial meeting at the Norwegian public broadcaster as I try to explain all of this, and the journalists just staring at me with a lack of comprehension. But I think that the news story from Israel needs to be understood with a different set of tools, because it is not, in my opinion, a news story. It doesn't behave like any other news story. For example, the staffing that we discussed. If Israel is a news story, how is it possible that it has been staffed or covered more than any other international story over the last 50 or perhaps even more years, right? Other international stories will peak and fade. That's how a news story works. You remember, no doubt, Yugoslavia, big international news story, early 90s, Yugoslavia falls apart, terrible violence. That's a news story for about a year, and it goes away. Russia-Ukraine is big now. It will be gone soon. There are other international stories that come and go. The Israel story never fades. It never goes away. It doesn't behave like a news story. It elicits a response that is elicited by no other news story. There's no other international news story that elicits the kind of deep outrage that the Israel-Palestine story does. Here you have at the moment a certain movement toward boycott of Russia, for example, but it doesn't have the depth of the Israel boycott, which has been going on for decades and will continue for decades. The idea that there is something uniquely wrong about this country, that this country must, with a unique set of tools, be marked as different, must be tagged in some way, must be quarantined in some way, and must be made to disappear. That is a very unique conclusion, and it's not driven by any other news story. So my conclusion from this is that this is not a news story. What this is, in fact, is a morality story. It's a deep morality story that is designed to address Western concerns about the West. It has almost nothing to do with an actual country called Israel, and that's why tweaking the coverage with 3 or 4 stories is not going to do it. This is a different kind of story. What it is a powerful moral parable about power. People in the West feel deeply that the power balance is out of whack, that we're too powerful, and they feel deeply injustice done to the third world, and they feel deeply that the West is too powerful and other people are not powerful enough. And we see it on the streets of New York, and we see it on the streets of Oslo. There are differences in power between people of different ethnicities, of different races, and it makes us deeply uncomfortable. And there's a deep discomfort in the West with colonialism, with militarism, with the history of Western domination. And you need some way to process that story. And as is so often done in Western societies, that deep discomfort is being processed with a story about Jews who embody the negative characteristics that a society sees at a given time. So the Jews in this story are powerful, Western, militarized, mechanized, prosperous, and white, and their opponents are the opposite on all of those counts, and that produces a very powerful moral story that is not about Israel, it's about you. And that's why it's so deep, and that's why it elicits the kind of response that it elicits, and that's why, even with my best intentions in my week as the head of the Norwegian public broadcaster, I won't be able to change it, because it's not a question of selecting the right story for a given day. It's about understanding what this narrative really is and the deep recesses of the Western brain that's producing it. It's not about, overlooking Israel's positive contribution. It's about what is the purpose of news coverage? What is the purpose of this kind of storytelling? And in my opinion, news coverage of Israel is serving a purpose that is much closer to what would have once been a sermon. It's a deeply theological, almost, certainly moral story about human failing. It's not another news story like Russia-Ukraine.
And talking about Russia-Ukraine, have you seen a change in the media's attitude towards Israel after the Russian invasion of Ukraine?
Everything has been great since then. The coverage has been amazing. What you saw in an interesting way in the first few months of this was people looking for the angle of attack against Israel. Like the events in Ukraine somehow had to be made into a critique of Israel, and the angle, which was pretty central for a while, was that Israel was being insufficiently supportive of Ukraine, because Israel has, of course, unfortunately for us, the Russian military on our border with Syria. So we have this very sensitive and very important and kind of foggy set of agreements with the Russians about what we may and may not do in Syrian airspace. And Israel's very concerned with not undermining that agreement, and that has meant that Israel cannot come out in a very explicit way, although it has come out in various implicit ways on the Ukrainian side. And there was a real critique of Israel in that regard. Almost anything that happens in the world will be subverted by a certain number of reporters and activists to be an anti-Israel critique. You can see it on climate. There's a a segment of the press that was critical of Israel on climate. Of course, LGBT issues are used against Israel in interesting and creative ways, and there are many other examples of that. And that was done with Ukraine too. I think that this story does have the effect, and we were discussing this before the talk in Conrad, that the Russia-Ukraine conflict has taken some of the attention of European governments who might otherwise find the time to pay more attention to Israel. And people have other things on their mind, they're more cognizant of power dynamics. They might be more cognizant of needing the Americans on side just in case. And that makes the Israel issue a lesson in concern to the people actually in the corridors of power. Although, of course, Israel remains a prime concern for the people in the corridors of the academy and the press and what we would more broadly call, I suppose, the left.
So, but the conclusion is not that we will hope for more wars in Europe.
No, we certainly do not want more wars in Europe. We simply want journalists with a more realistic take on what the world actually is.
Okay. What do you think of international media, L'chaim, coverage of the Abraham Accords?
If you want to say L'chaim, it has to be something better than water next time.
Oh, sorry. But,
but the water's pretty good.
100% good.
The Abraham Accords, I'm glad that you asked about that because it allows us to say something positive. The Abraham Accords are a wonderful point of light for us. And I had a personal experience of this because the peace agreement was signed, the normalization agreement, I guess you would say, with the United Arab Emirates. And for Israelis, going to the UAE until a few years ago was like going to Mars. No one even dreamed of going to the United Arab Emirates. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, because we didn't know that this was cooking, the UAE signs a normalization agreement, and also Bahrain, and also Morocco, which is very important because there are about 1 million Israelis who have some Moroccan heritage. So many Israelis see Morocco kind of as a homeland. And suddenly we have normalization agreements. So I went to the airport. It was a week or two after the agreement was made public. I went to Ben Gurion Airport. I got on a low-cost flight to Dubai. And it just said Dubai on the sign in the airport. And really, for us, it was like as if it said Jupiter or something. And I got on the airplane, and the airplane's packed with Israelis, just normal Israelis, not journalists or anything like that, just people who were going to go to Dubai. And we take off. And instead of going west, which our planes usually do, the plane goes east. And it went over Saudi Arabia. And we're all following the flight map. And we see that the plane's crossing into Saudi airspace. Saudi Arabia is, for us, an enemy country. And we're in Saudi Arabia, and then we fly right over Riyadh, the capital of Saudi Arabia. Again, an enemy capital for us, at least until a week before. And the Israeli guy who's sitting next to me on the plane kind of elbows me in the ribs like this, and he says, Historia, history. And it really was history. We land in Dubai, and we get out in the airport in Dubai, and I see that Israelis have immediately decided that Dubai is like Netanya. It's like they've decided it's an Israeli city, and they're shouting in Hebrew in the airport, and they're walking around with kippot and big stars of David, and it's in the mall in Dubai, Chana, Tavit, Atik, and like people yelling in Hebrew in the mall, and it's just an amazing thing. In the Persian Gulf, like really within eyesight of Iran, you can actually see Iran across the Persian Gulf, and it was quite an amazing thing. The coverage has been, I think, again, because the coverage is a moral critique, the coverage was largely critical, or there were attempts to find critical angles on it, even though you would think that it would be an almost completely positive development. No one lost anything. It was pure gain. Nothing. No one had to give up anything in particular. But because there's this hostility to Israel, it was portrayed as a weapons deal, or it was portrayed as a deal between kind of dark authoritarian regimes, and suddenly people discovered that the Emiratis are terrible, and that these are dark actors in the Middle East. No one had cared about them 2 weeks earlier, but now that there had to be some kind of critical angle on the Accords, this was discovered. Chiefly, the political scene that runs the coverage was unhappy that Israel had been given anything without making concessions to the Palestinians. That was the problem. The story, as we know, is an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And this suggests that it's not. Right? These normalization agreements suggest that there is an Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but that is only one of many stories that Israel is involved in, and that needs to be resisted because it would undermine the whole story. If Israel can normalize with other Sunni countries who don't seem to particularly care about Palestinian concerns, that undermines the idea that there is a cosmic conflict going on in Israel between Jews and Muslims. And that's why the agreements had to be at the very least marginalized, if not portrayed as a negative development. And it's just another example of how news coverage has become a political tool to be wielded by, people who have a certain political agenda that they're pursuing, and not an explanatory tool that's meant to help us make sense of things.
Very interesting. I can tell you that the Norwegian ambassador to Tel Aviv was here yesterday, and he spoke about what they thought in the Norwegian Foreign Ministry about the Abraham Accords, and it was quite obvious from what he said that the assessment in the Norwegian Foreign Ministry is very positive towards the Abraham Accords, that it opens up for possibilities for good for everybody, and he even emphasized also for the Palestinians, just so that you know. Yeah. Now, I'm sorry, we have a couple of more questions, but we don't have a couple of more minutes. So, please be back here exactly